Elvis Presley and Lisa Marie Presley were a father and daughter bound by stage lights and the volatile quiet of home. Elvis loved generously, then withdrew with cousins and confidants orbiting the Graceland house. Lisa Marie learned the grammar of fame early, the velvet rope, the camera flash, the promise of sanctuary behind the iron gates. Their bond held tenderness and strain, a child searching for her father inside a myth that would not sit still. Family and spectacle, often both at once. The legend did not sleep. Elvis embodied American possibility, a voice that broke rules and remade the chart in his image. He also carried appetites that pressed against his health, an early warning coded into triumph. Lisa Marie, born to inheritance and scrutiny, navigated headline marriages and a music career shadowed by comparisons, wearing the Presley surname as armor and burden. The garden held a truth more intimate than the rumor mill ever managed. Death came to Elvis within the house that made him in the late years of the 1970s, and a nation stood stunned on the front lawn. Lisa Marie was a child when mourning turned the gates into an altar. Decades later, tragedy came for Lisa Marie with cruel speed, leaving unfinished conversations to echo down the hall. Father and daughter, separated by eras, were drawn together again. This time, forever. The meditation garden at Graceland is a domestic ground turned into a pilgrimage. The curved walk embraces a fountain, and the family stones gather in a quiet circle. Elvis rests beneath a marker bright with offerings, notes, and guitar picks, and sun-faded carnations. Lisa Marie lies near him in the same plot, the geometry of closeness finally uncomplicated. The house watches over them, white columns and a front door that knows their footsteps. The stillness is deliberate. There is irony in spectacle yielding to quiet, in a life of neon concluding beside a small pool where birds pause to bathe. Graceland marketed a myth, yet the garden returns them to human scale, father and daughter among kin. Elvis brought the country to this hilltop, and Lisa Marie brought the family back to its center. Fame was loud, but the resting place speaks softly. What came next, after the noise, was a garden and a circle of stone. A homecoming and its cost. John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Patrick Bouvier Kennedy meet in memory, a young president and the child he barely held. John married Jacqueline in an alliance of ambition and elegance, a union that staged politics as style without losing seriousness. The family moved as a dynasty in rehearsal, siblings in chorus, cameras everywhere. Inside that brightness, fragility waited. Patrick arrived early, his breaths counted by machines, a father pacing between hospital corridors and national duty. Hope narrowed to a trembling hour. Scandal shadowed the wider clan, yet John's brief presidency carried a clean line of purpose. He stood at a Cold War brink and spoke for sacrifice, while private indiscretions trailed him like rumor. Patrick's short life cut through the pageantry. No debates, no rivalries, only the stark fact of love and loss. The public learned contradiction, then watched a father brought low by grief that language could not hold. The truth behind the eternal flame was darker still. Death reached John on a sunlit Texas street, and that November froze a generation in place. Jacqueline chose a hill at Arlington that looked back toward the Capitol he tried to reshape. The eternal flame lit a permanent vigil, a small fire against a long night. Patrick's grave, modest and near, whispers beside that public blaze. A palm-sized marker sits within the family cluster, where mothers kneel and the wind carries the cadence of ceremony. The contrast is relentless. Arlington turns sorrow into ritual. White marble lines the slope, footsteps soften, orders drift across the grass. John lies beneath a simple cross, his name cut with restraint, while Jacqueline and the infants form a protective ring. Patrick is almost hidden in that geometry, a small square that insists on being found. The flame flickers, then steadies, a heartbeat translated into fire. The ground teaches decorum. Irony gathers here. A presidency built in spectacle resolves in a fire that does not perform. A child who never spoke becomes the truest counterpoint to rhetoric. John promised a new frontier, then left his family at the edge of a grave, the frontier reduced to a few feet of earth. Patrick's presence shifts the scale, father and son reunified by a cemetery's quiet law. Fame shouts, memory whispers. What came next, after drums and horses, was a small stone and a flame that will not go out. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Sarah Delano Roosevelt were a son and mother fused by ambition and habit. Franklin married Eleanor and enlarged his world, yet Sarah kept the keys to Springwood, the Hyde Park estate that fixed his compass. She financed houses, mediated tensions, and guarded prospects with steely courtesy. Franklin's charm met his mother's discipline, a duet that schooled a politician in the domestic theater. The household ran on ritual and expectation. Love, restraint, advantage. Scandal made the circle human. Franklin's attachment to Lucy Rutherford strained a marriage already freighted by duty, while Sarah's constant presence created privacy shaped like a stage set. Adversity gave the family its core. Polio struck in the early 1920s, and the young politician, undone in body, rebuilt his will. Sarah gathered doctors and funds, protective in ways both maternal and strategic. Eleanor turned to activism and purpose, a separate orbit that still held the house. Strength forged in those rooms would soon face the nation's storms. War years expanded the domestic drama to world scale. Seated yet unbent, Franklin steered the country through depression and global conflict. Springwood hosted kings on its lawn, radios murmured in the day halls, and the president rested beneath trees that knew him since boyhood. Sarah aged with dignity, the matriarch moving through rooms measured by staff footsteps. World play abroad, family play at home. The portraits hid a more precise intimacy. Death arrived close to the Hudson. Sarah died in the early 1940s, leaving a silence that altered the house. Franklin died in the mid-1940s at Warm Springs and was brought home for burial. The Springwood garden is clipped and modest, a rectangle of lawn hemmed by hedges, a pale stone that does not boast. Franklin and Eleanor lie within that measured green, with Sarah remembered in the same family precinct. The setting is careful, restrained. Hyde Park grants proportion to unruly lives. The path to the graves feels like a chapel without walls, river air moving through leaves and stone. The most public of men now lies in a space scaled to family conversation, close to a mother who once kept the household clock. What came next, after victory speeches and hard decisions, was an enclosure of green and a line of names. The irony is tender. World-changing policy resolves in a garden no larger than a tennis court, and a son once guided by a commanding mother now rests within sight of her memorial. Franklin's arc from privilege to empathy began here, then returned here, altered by history and humbled by time. The stone lists no triumphs. It announces presence. Fame evaporates in the Hudson breeze. Home answers spectacle with proportion and returns its own to earth. Theodore Roosevelt and Martha Mitty Bulloch Roosevelt were bound by contrasts, frail boy and dazzling belle, asthma and ballroom. Mitty, born to Georgia gentility, carried a southern poise that survived war and dislocation. Theodore married Edith after youthful heartbreak, kept Oyster Bay as anchor, and balanced domestic steadiness with a public appetite for risk. Family set the meter. Ambition supplied the melody. Scandal and sorrow arrived early. The Gilded Age loved Theodore's vigor, then winced at his combat with bosses, a reformer who enjoyed the theater of conflict. He strode into legend as a rough rider, praised and contested in equal measure. Mitty's loyalties frayed under Civil War pressures, a Southern daughter in Northern rooms. Then catastrophe struck. On a single winter day, Theodore lost his first wife and his mother in the same house. The truth of his drive darkened. Grief taught him a new cadence. He fled west to outrun sorrow, then returned to politics sharpened by hardship, preaching the strenuous life as creed and shield. At Sagamore Hill, children raced across porches, and Edith kept the rhythm he could not hold alone. Public quarrels hardened into policy, antitrust, conservation, and a diplomacy that preferred firm words to foolish boasts. The legend gathered gravity. The end came in the late 19-teens, in the old house, winter lights slanting from the bay. Theodore was carried to Young's Memorial Cemetery, a hillside tucked among oaks and maples, the family cluster reached by a climbing path. The stone is modest for a president, the setting doing most of the speaking. Nearby, other Roosevelts gather, the clan mapped in granite. Mitty rests in the same cemetery, her poise reduced to a quiet line in Oyster Bay soil. The trees keep their secret. Young's Memorial rewards those who climb. Harbor water flashes through branches, birds fuss in thickets, and town turns to memory within a few steps. Sagamore Hill waits up the road, trophies and children's books staged in rooms where loss once stood. Here, the memorials adopt Long Island understatement. Theodore, who thundered on platforms, accepts a view instead of a pedestal. Mitty, who taught charm as discipline, keeps him company without spectacle. Irony is gentle here. A life of action ends in a place that invites pause. A man who commanded headlines yields to a marker easy to miss. A mother who once lit parlors is now a name among leaves and stone. What came next, after charge and countercharge, was a slope, a family cluster, and the sound of wind in trees. John Davison Rockefeller and John Davison Rockefeller Jr. were father and son across a temperamental divide, one a relentless builder of trusts, the other a careful steward of legacy. Senior married Laura and disciplined Fortune with ledgers and hymns. Junior, raised in caution and prayer, married Abby and shaped philanthropy into vocation. A stern father softened into patriarch, a dutiful son turned conscience into policy. Family, capital, and duty moved in concert. Scandal framed the ascent, reform shaped the reply. Standard Oil spread like a tide, efficiency admired, ruthlessness alleged, the antitrust crusade turning Senior into a symbol. Junior learned to steady the name, funding health, education, and shared spaces that outlast bluster. Together they wrote an American argument, enterprise tempered by responsibility. The Cleveland Monument became the verdict rendered in stone. Death came at a stately pace. Senior eased into extreme age, a grandfather on golf links and in pews. Junior matured into stewardship, preparing heirs to inherit more than accounts. Lakeview Cemetery holds the Rockefeller family cluster, a measured enclosure within one of the nation's grand garden cemeteries where hills rise, ponds glimmer, and trees borrow the language of cathedrals. Permanence without ostentation, taught in granite. At the heart stands a towering obelisk, pale and precise, anchoring a geometry of disciplined markers. Senior lies within the ground he selected, his name cut with restraint. Junior keeps company nearby, his stone joining a chorus of kin, dates, and initials turning history into a quiet ledger. Records and on-site guides confirm the cluster and its design. The obelisk holds the memory steady. The setting elevates humility into spectacle, a paradox they mastered. Paths curve past mausoleums, then open to the obelisk, commanding without shouting. The city that made the fortune hums beyond the gates, while inside, water and wind do the speaking. A dynasty becomes a landscape feature, less boast than landmark. Irony gathers at the base. A man blamed for building too large accepts a monument that narrows to a point, and a son devoted to repair rests beneath the same vertical verdict. Wealth that once felt private now sits inside public green, strangers strolling past on Sunday afternoons. What came next, after boardrooms and hearings, was a pillar, a family cluster, and a Cleveland sky. Henry Ford and Edsel Ford were joined by invention and divided by temperament, assembly line thunder, and quiet design. Henry married Clara and forged a creed from thrift and tinkering, scaled to factories and wages. Edsel married Eleanor and moved with gentler cadence, a patron of style and arts, translating efficiency into grace. In Dearborn, the family compound ran like a factory with a hearth, clocks, and suppers schooling a company and a country. Duty sounded like a bell. Achievement drew scandal and consequence. Henry's genius simplified production and complicated lives, his anti-union stubbornness and published prejudices staining the record. Battles at the River Rouge turned philosophy into security protocols, and the bruises showed. Edsel, heir and modernizer, urged refinement, better engines, better lines, a culture less combative. He bore the weight with courtesy, translating thunder into rain. Stress gathered like the weather. Edsel died in the early 1940s, far too young, his body taxed by pressure and responsibility. Henry, aging into legend, stepped back toward the helm, a return of brittle magic. The family chose restraint for their final statements in stone. Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit holds the Ford family mausoleum and plot, a sober granite structure within trees that turn industry into hush. The city's machinery fades at the gate. The mausoleum is classical and unornamented, proportions doing the work of speech. Names are cut plainly, letters crisp as milled parts. Henry rests here beside Clara, the pair whose household remade wages and weekends. Edsel lies within the same ground, his stone a lesson in balance, the heir who might have remade the company's soul if years had allowed. Other Fords gather in a careful cluster, lineage translated into granite. Woodlawn favors contemplation. Curving lanes and mature oaks reduce industrial memory to human measure. Detroit hums beyond the perimeter, while inside, Leaf Talk carries the story. Restraint is the argument. Irony rests in the shade. A man who multiplied motion ends in silence, and a son who sought elegance lies in plain geometry he likely approved. The assembly line promised speed, yet the mausoleum insists on pause. What came next after strikes and slogans was a quiet door, a family room in a city of engines, and the long patience of trees. Walter Elias Disney and Sharon May Disney Brown were father and daughter joined by imagination and guarded privacy. Walt married Lillian, built a studio where mice spoke and castles rose, and managed a smile that was both sincere and strategic. Sharon, adopted as an infant, grew inside that enchanted machinery, married Robert Brown, and tried domestic rhythms away from Klieg lights. She kept a careful distance between family life and a culture eager to trespass. Home became a hedge. Controversy shadowed the magic. Walt met labor strikes with a flinty spine, fought for control, and embraced tie-ins that critics called brazen. Allies gathered in city halls, enemies on union lines. Sharon came of age after that turbulence, tested independence, weathered health strains, and sought a private adulthood the tabloids hunted. The studio polished the narrative, while the human story stayed fragile. The truth behind the gates kept its own counsel. Walt died in the mid-1960s, lungs undone after decades of work and smoke, leaving sketches of another park. The funeral was small by design. Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale received him into a sheltered garden behind hedges and iron that prefer to whisper. A bronze plaque bears his name, and Lillian's, phrased with restraint. The ground asks for quiet. Sharon lived into the early 1990s, her health unsteady, her wish for privacy intact. She rests within the Disney family garden, near the plaque that draws the faithful, yet not fully on display. Low stone, small planters, and a bench invite contemplation rather than photography. Security keeps the gaze respectful. The circle stayed close. Forest Lawn is manicured and theatrical, yet the Disney corner reads modest. The markers are small, inscriptions brief, shade committed to shelter. Beyond the hedges, freeways, and lots pulse. Inside, footsteps slow on gravel, leaves scrape iron, and fame yields to lawn. Irony thrives in that modest corner. The cellar of wonder lies behind a gate most will never open, and a daughter raised within spectacle is finally granted privacy. The kingdom finds its limit in a hedge, the brand ends in a bronze oval. What came next after parades and castles was a small garden, a family plot, and a view designed to be overlooked. George Herbert Walker Bush and Pauline Robin Bush were bound by service and a grief that never lost its edge. George married Barbara, a partnership of steadiness and wit, and their life moved through duty posts and new towns, a household that turned upheaval into resilience. In that orbit, Robin arrived, fair and lively, a small light in rooms already trained for hope. The optimism of young parents set the tone. Illness rewrote the script. In the early 1950s, Robin sickened with leukemia, a diagnosis with few treatments and almost no mercy. George and Barbara learned to bargain with days, measuring color in cheeks and strength in steps, then bracing as the tide reversed. The wider Bush story gathered politics and controversy, oil deals, and elections. Robin's short life remained the private truth, a sorrow that gentled George's manner and stiffened Barbara's spine. The truth behind slogans was quieter and more durable. Decades later, after a ladder of offices and a return to private citizenship, age found George still game for skydiving and notes in a tidy hand. When death came in the late 20-teens, it closed a disciplined march. He was brought to College Station, to the grounds of his presidential library, to rest beside Barbara and be reunited with Robin, whose grave had waited like a held breath. Nearness was the final doctrine. The burial site sits beyond brick and glass, near a pond that mirrors Texas sky. Live oaks forming a canopy both domestic and ceremonial. 2 headstones rise with clean restraint, and a smaller marker completes the triangle. George lies beside Barbara, the marriage sealed in marble, and Robin rests a step away. The scene reads as a family yard trimmed to public purpose. The hush belongs to both histories. The grounds invite walking and conversation, more veranda than necropolis. Security is present, yet the space encourages ordinary gestures, a nod toward the stones, a private prayer. It feels like a homecoming denied in 1953, made permanent by design. The geography promises that work and love can share an address. Irony settles lightly. A life threaded through war zones, embassies, and the Oval Office returns to a modest enclosure behind a library, a father keeping close the child he could not save. Power once measured by polling becomes proximity, 3 stones and a pond catching clouds. What came next, after campaigns and ceremonies, was a small family garden on academic ground and the tender mercy of reunion. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. and Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. were father and son cast in the same alloy, ambition hardened by Boston grit and Catholic discipline. Joseph Sr. married Rose and built a clan that rehearsed excellence at breakfast, report cards, and Latin, piano, and boxing metaphors. He invested with a gambler's calm, threaded politics through studio lots and embassies, and spoke of destiny like household duty. Joe Jr., eldest and anointed, excelled by instinct and wore expectation like a tailored coat. In that family, promise was policy. Scandal shaped the father's legend, sacrifice defined the son's. Joseph Sr. remade reputations as deftly as portfolios, a Wall Street adept turned Hollywood banker, then ambassador to London as war gathered. His isolationist lean chilled allies, his charm curdled into controversy. Joe Jr. chose flight training and war, a tidy answer to doubts about his father's stance. He flew over Europe with practiced ease, volunteered for a dangerous experiment, and embraced duty without flourish. The family's wager, placed in peace, was called in war. Death found Joe Jr. in the mid-1940s above the English countryside when the experimental aircraft exploded in flight. No remains returned to the kitchen that schooled him. Joseph Sr., who could fix much with money or will, was powerless before the simplest task, to bring a son home. Brookline's Holyhood Cemetery would hold the patriarch Arlington a marker for the son. Two places gathered one story. At Holyhood, Joseph Sr.'s grave rests within New England contours, a family plot framed by modest markers and clipped hedges. The stone is reserved, names and dates only. Confidence that declines to declaim. Glamour returns to parish scale. Ambition reduced to granite's grammar. The quiet feels corrective. Arlington speaks in another register. On rolling slopes where white stones march, a cenotaph bears Joe Jr.'s name and rank, a monument for a life without remains. It stands near the Kennedy cluster, an echo that points toward other losses and another flame. Visitors pause at the name, then scan the horizon, as if the missing might still be found in the ranks of stone. Absence becomes witness. Irony threads between the two grounds. A father known for presence lies in parish quiet, while a son known for action is honored by a monument to absence. Joseph Sr. believed in control, yet war took his heir beyond retrieval. Continuity survived by grief, a younger brother stepping forward because an elder vanished into air. What came next was a hometown stone, a military marker, and a family story stretched across two cemeteries, one with a body, one with a name. George Herman Babe. Ruth and Dorothy Ruth Perrone were bound by blood and complicated by rumor, a father larger than life and a daughter living beside the echo. Babe married young, then lived as if every night were a pennant race, hotels and hot dogs, cheers and headlines, appetites that made legends blush. Dorothy grew through that weather, raised within arrangements that blurred lines, her identity tugged by stories she did not script. They loved in their way, with visits, gifts, and the ache of distance in rooms too public. Fame rearranged kinship. Scandal found Ruth as easily as he found a fastball. The Bambino broke records and rules, a folk hero and a cautionary tale. Guilt and glamour braided tightly. He shook off curfews until his body kept its own. Dorothy's adulthood carried the residue, a surname that opened doors and reopened debates, her marriage and memoirs parsing what the press had smeared into spectacle. The truth behind box scores stayed stubbornly human. Death came in the late 1940s, cancer closing the circle that ballparks had widened. The city mourned like a congregation, lines snaking past a cathedral, boys in caps and men with hats in hand. He was brought to Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, a Catholic resting place with lawns shaped like quiet thought. His grave drew pilgrims at once, bristling with baseballs, rosaries, coins, and notes. Grief turned into pastime. Dorothy lived for decades fashioning ordinary years from an extraordinary inheritance. When her time came in the late 1980s, she joined the family ground at Gate of Heaven, near the plot where Babe's great slab commands admirers and kin. Proximity resolves rumor into geography, father and daughter sharing the same sweep of grass and shade. The cemetery confirms what gossip could not. Gate of Heaven holds the energy of a parish picnic made solemn. Babe's marker wears offerings like a uniform that never ages. Dorothy's stone, more modest, reads with the dignity of choice, positioned not to compete but to belong. The geometry teaches the lesson, exuberance and steadiness sharing a field. Irony lingers along the path. A man who redrew outfields lies beneath a stone that collects trinkets like box scores, while a daughter who endured speculation rests within the radius of devotion that once made privacy impossible. The diamond's roar is now a murmur. What came next after parades and headlines was a family plot, a pilgrimage of caps and flowers and wind moving softly through grass. Louis Daniel Armstrong and Mary May Ann Albert were son and mother, horn and backbone, a genius lifted by a woman who held the line. Louis married twice before finding calm with Lucille in Corona, Queens, a modest brick home of tapes and laughter. Mayan worked wherever work appeared, steadying a boy with a restless ear and a need for purpose. Their bond crossed miles and years, letters and remittances and pride. The rhythm began at her table. Scandal skimmed the legend. Louis played segregated halls, then spoke when conscience demanded, a smile that could turn solemn in a breath. Critics argued over caricature, and Armstrong answered with choruses, solos as theses on joy, as resistance. He made the trumpet a narrator, then made the narrator a friend. Mayan's name followed him into dressing rooms and hotel lobbies, a reminder that genius stands on a mother's labor. The truth behind the grin was disciplined and deep. Death came in the early 1970s, a summer night returning him from tours to the stillness of his Corona home. He was brought to Flushing Cemetery, an unpretentious ground that suits the borough's working pulse, where grass runs long and trees shade without sermon. The marker is modest, a portrait medallion catching his face as if a note were about to lift. Fans arrive with flowers, sometimes a trumpet mute. Mayan rests in the same family area, her stone near the son who turned thrift into gold. The plot is not spectacle, it is a promise kept, money sent home returning as presents. Guides point to the cluster, proud that Queens holds what New Orleans began. The space feels like a kitchen turned inside out, a table built from earth. The geometry is clear. Flushing is a place of steady steps and local ritual. Planes arc faintly toward runways, the sound bowing under canopies. Louis's grave draws pilgrims who hum a bar, leave a folded note, or set a stone atop. Bronze. The effect is neighborly, not grand. Mayan's presence grounds the scene in origin tale and obligation. Irony smiles, gently. The most famous horn in America rests beneath a quiet Queen's sky, and the woman who taught him persistence lies within arm's reach. The world called him Satchmo, yet the ground calls him Louis, a son and a neighbor. What came next, after tours and ovations, was a shared plot in Flushing, planes overhead, grass underfoot, and a reunion without announcement. Memory keeps the tempo. The rest is rest. Robert Francis Kennedy and David Anthony Kennedy, the infant who stayed only days, inhabit the same ground where history and hush share a slope. Robert married Ethel, a union of Catholic nerves and kinetic purpose, a household that multiplied children and causes with equal fervor. Brothers became a creed, campaigns and quarrels turning family into institution. Inside that ardor, fragility visited. An infant arrived and departed within a narrow span of hours. Love measured itself in vigil rather than words. Struggle marked Robert's ascent. As Attorney General, he pursued labor rackets and segregation's machinery with a prosecutor's edge, earning devotion and enmity in the same breath. Conscience pulled him from calculation toward compassion, faces and names becoming policy. He carried a brother's death like private weather, thunder behind the eyes. The child he lost stood behind that tenderness like a quiet tutor. The truth beneath rallies was grief. Death reached Robert in the late 1960s beneath hotel chandeliers and television lights, a campaign cut in a moment that folded the decade upon itself. The funeral train stitched cities together in a tear-lined seam. He was brought to Arlington, downhill from a brother's flame, to a parcel that resists spectacle. A white cross, a flat marker, a steady slope. The argument is restraint. Within the same section, small stones remember the infants and children the Kennedys could not keep, markers so near the grass one must bow to read them. David's name joins that soft chorus, dynasty reduced to nursery, household reduced to vigil. The geometry invites pilgrimage and discourages intrusion. Wind, flag, footfall. Arlington translates biography into alignment. White rows draw the eye toward horizon and principle. while the Kennedy enclave tucks into the land like a hand closing on a keepsake. Robert's Cross faces the city he hoped to reform, the river that carries rumor out to sea. The infant stones complicate the tableau, beginnings that barely began. Irony runs quiet. A life of hard choices ends in chosen simplicity, and a father famed for eloquence is paired with a child whose name must be spoken softly to be heard. Power becomes a path and a cross and a few steps of trimmed grass. What came next, after trains and requiems, was a white cross, a small stone, and the long discipline of memory. Nathaniel Nat King Cole and Perlina Adams Coles were son and mother, velvet voice, and church-rooted discipline. Nat married Maria, a partnership of poise and calculation that navigated segregation with grace sharpened into strategy. Their home held pianos and scripts, rehearsal and school, a family trained to move through rooms that were not always welcoming. The melody learned its manners at Perlina's table. Controversy followed the ascent. Nat crossed from jazz to pop with ease that offended purists and delighted crowds. He endured assaults of a racial nature on stage and at home, spoke with calm where anger seemed natural, and bought into a neighborhood that preferred he did not. Sponsors shrank from his television show, The Line Too Bright to Cross. Perlina's lessons held dignity as armor, patience as tactic. The smile masked tensile strength. Death came early in the mid-1960s, cigarettes exacting their price. Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale received him, a cemetery practiced in discretion. His grave lies within manicured calm, markers flush to grass, inscriptions brief and exact. Fans leave roses and careful notes. The quiet suits his phrasing. Perlina rests there as well, her stone within reach of the son who carried her teaching into every microphone. The proximity completes the family grammar, names without boasts, a garden that smooths history's roughness. Mother and son, the lesson, and its echo. Forest Lawn can be theatrical, yet the Cole plot reads modest, a pause rather than a scene. Blue sky, patterned shade, visitors standing with pew-borne posture. The place prefers listening to photographs. Irony hums low. A voice that made America lean closer now lies under a marker that asks America to speak softly, while the mother who trained elegance keeps close. What came next, after spotlights and studio glare, was a lawn, a pair of stones, and the discipline of quiet his music honored.